So the aim of this project was to try and reconstruct an ocean-going ship of the ancient type, like the one from the Ajanta painting, and do it while at least somebody remembers some part of the stitching technique, and then attempt to sail it. I went to the Ministry of Culture and asked them if they would fund something like this, and they said yes, they had some funding for some project like this. I then took this project to the Indian Navy and the Ministry of Defense, and to my good fortune, they agreed. Then, of course, I needed help from the Ministry of External Affairs, because if I wanted to sail this outside Indian waters, and then Ministry of Shipping. So now that the ship was named, incorporated, the issue became of trying to sail it. So then came the time for doing actually a voyage from Porbandar to Muscat was decided, in the presence of His Excellency the Omani Ambassador to India and all the many top officials of the Indian Navy. The flag-off happened on 29th of December 2025. The plan was to do the maiden voyage from Porbandar to Muscat. So this is what the ship looks like when it is in full flow. So the story that I'm going to tell you about is the story of INSV Kaundinya. This is really the part of a project to explore India's ancient past. And as many of you may be aware, I've been writing about this for quite some time. One of my books from about a decade ago called The Ocean of Churn explored India's maritime past. And India's maritime past is very, very old. It goes back 4,000-5,000 years. Back all the way through the Harappan period, where Indian merchants were sailing out towards Oman and all the way through to Mesopotamia. But this project is a more specific one. It is about trying to look at the kinds of ships Indians used in the earliest period to do these explorations and voyages, not only westward towards Arabia and the Red Sea, trading with the Romans and so on, but also eastward to Indonesia, Cambodia, all the way through to Japan and Korea. So this is really about trying to dig out the kind of technologies used to do these voyages. And so this is the story of an attempt to recreate one of the sort of ships that did these kinds of voyages. So I began to look for what would be the earliest depictions of Indian ships that existed. Now, we know that in the Harappan period there was mercantile activities. We have evidence of ports like Dholavira and Lothal and Bet Dwarka and so on. But unfortunately, while we know what their anchors look like, which were made of stone, we don't know what their ships look like. We have some images of their river boats on their seals. And sometimes some people try to extrapolate their river boats onto ocean-going vessels. But to anybody involved in looking at ocean-going vessels, river boats look as different from a ship, an ocean-going ship, as a cricket bat looks from a tennis racket. So it is therefore quite clear from those seals that those are river boats. So after digging around quite a lot, this is the earliest evidence I've seen of a ship that I know for certain is an ocean-going vessel, is a Satvahana coin, which is the one on the right. You can see that it is clearly an ocean-going ship from the shape of the hull and from the fact that it has sails but it doesn't have too much of a rowing thing, so it's obviously an ocean-going ship. And it also has, if you can see, a steering oar at the end. But it's a very rough and ready depiction, but it's from somewhere between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD. Later depictions are clearer, and here is one of them from more than 1,000 years later, of a boat relief from the Bhog Mandap of the Jagannath Puri temple. And here you can see the hull much more clearly, and you can see something interesting about it. It is not nailed together, but stitched together. Can you see that? You can clearly see all the ropes going around and stitching the whole thing together. And this is interesting because there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the technologies Indian used to build ships involved essentially stitching together the ships. Now, this is not because Indians did not have they did not have rust-free nails. They did. We know that from the iron pillar in Mehrauli. But for a variety of reasons, usually they did not nail their ships together. They stitched them together literally the way we stitch together clothes, and I will show you how. There are also evidence in texts like the Yukti Kalpataru from the 10th century, where we hear about these ships that Indians were building. They were huge. Look at the very biggest ships at the bottom, the Dharini and the Bigini. They were 160 cubits long. A cubit is about half a meter. So that's an 80-meter long ship. We don't know how many of them they built, but certainly they must have built a few. So these were huge ships by modern standards. You can also see accounts by foreign travelers and historians and so on. And Ptolemy, for example, from the 10th century, from Alexandria, was a Greco-Roman geographer. He mentions that Indian shipbuilders built fleets of up to 2,000 ships, and each of them were capable of accommodating 1,000 troops, horses, etc. So this is not a trivial size ships. Marco Polo mentions them, Niccolo Conti mentions them, Stefano Santo mentions them. It is interesting that Marco Polo does mention nailed ships. I want you to know this so that you know that Indians built their ships by stitching together by preference, not because they didn't have the technology to build nailed ships. In fact, they were trading with countries that built nailed ships, like the Chinese, but they preferred to build it this way. So I kept looking for better depictions, and this is probably the earliest clear depiction of an ocean-going ship that we have. Cave number 2, Ajanta, this is from 4th, 5th century. You can see that it is got 3 sails, it's got a foresail, it's clearly an ocean-going ship. There is a steering oar, there's a sailor there. Now this is clearly an artistic depiction, but it tells you quite a lot of things about ships of that time, including the fact that they used steering oars, not rudders, the fact that they had square sails, and so on. Now this stitching technique was used basically till the Europeans turned up in the Indian Ocean. And then it was abandoned for a variety of reasons, not the least cannons. The problem was not necessarily the other guy's cannons. The problem was that even if you had cannons of your own, if you fired it, the whiplash from it would loosen the stitching and consequently cause leakages. So ultimately, by the time of Shivaji, Indians also began to build European-style ships based on nailed technology. But you do have some stitch fishing boats still surviving. The technology is rapidly dying out because people are obviously moving on to more modern fiberglass metal boats. But you do have some of these still around, but they are not big ships. They are just small ships, and this technology is basically rapidly disappearing. And so the aim of this project was to try and reconstruct an ocean-going ship of the ancient type, like the one from the Ajanta painting, and do it while at least somebody remembers some part of the stitching technique, and then attempt to sail it. So this is what INSV Kaundinya is about. And the place to start was from making a simple sketch, schematic sketch of the Ajanta sailing ship. And you can see what it would look like if it was just cleaned up and sketched. The problem is obvious. While I may know a lot about statistics and GDP growth and all that kind of thing, I know nothing at all about how to build a ship. So this was the problem that I was grappling with in 2021 when I got lucky. It happened to be that I was preparing the economic survey of 2022, sitting in North Block, when one of my officers from the Indian Economic Service came and asked me if her husband, who was in the Navy, could sign a copy of The Ocean of Churn. So I said yes. So in walked Hemant. He gave me his book. I signed it. And then we got talking. And I discovered that he was not a sailor in the Navy. He was actually a naval architect. So I had got lucky. So he had, of course, never built a wooden ship. He was into designing aircraft carriers and such like. But thankfully for me, he found the project exciting. And so with his help, I managed to create a better design of what would be a more practical design for sailing the ship. So this is what it looks like after Hemant had kind of improved upon it. You can see we reduced the number of sails to 2. It still has the steering oar, but it now looks like more like a practical project. We began to put some parameters, length 21 meters, breadth 6.5 meters, depth to 3.3, weight approximately 50 tons, crew of 80. Here is the rigging plan, here is the mast plan, and very importantly, notice here, the sails are square. This is important because very often, if you see sailing ships, boats today, in the Olympics and so on, you will see that they are basically got different designed sails. And the advantage of those modern sails is that you can actually zigzag into the wind. Whereas these square sails cannot do that. So the best you can do is sail at a right angle to the wind, something that became an issue a little later. Now came the issue, how do we construct the ship? Now it happened to be that I present once in a while to the Honorable Prime Minister on mostly on economic issues. But sometimes I get an extra 5 minutes in the end where I give him a new idea. So some point in time in 2022, I took an extra 5 minutes and presented him the idea of building a ship based on this Ajanta painting and then attempt to sail it. So he heard me out, and after about 5-10 minutes he then was quiet for about 20 seconds. Then he said, "Karo." Then he was quiet for another 20 seconds, and then he said, "Par dubna mat." So with that encouragement, I went to the Ministry of Culture and asked them if they would fund something like this, and they said yes, they had some funding for some project like this. I then took this project to the Indian Navy and the Ministry of Defense, and to my good fortune, they agreed, and they not only said that they would help oversee the construction of this project, but when it was done, they would provide me with a crew to attempt to sail it. So I was beginning to hit the jackpot here. Then, of course, I needed help from the Ministry of External Affairs, because if I wanted to sail this outside Indian waters, and then Ministry of Shipping, which had to basically give me a clearance from a large number of modern safety norms, which obviously I would be violating. So with that, I had all the paperwork done. Now I needed somebody to actually be willing to construct it. Now, modern shipyards usually don't construct in wood, and if they do, this is an extremely risky project because it's completely experimental. But thankfully for me, Hodi Shipyards in Goa agreed to do this. And with them, along with them, we then identified Babu Sankaran, who is a traditional shipwright in Beypore in Kerala, to help actually build it. Now this was a really big deal because Babu comes from a family that used to build these ancient ships. For hundreds of years, they built these ancient ships. Obviously, the technology went into decline, but thankfully, Babu, when he was young, had been taught the rules of thumb of building a large ship. So he knew these rules, and he's now 65 years old, but his children are not interested in learning this at all, this whole technique. So, we were lucky to catch him while he was still young enough to work on this project and to help us. Otherwise, it would have literally been entirely lost. He had also worked on an Omani project called the Jewel of Muscat. So he was also familiar with the idea of doing recreation. Materials needed? Well, you need obviously wood. We were absolutely clear we would use only material that was available 2,000 years ago in India. So we used wild jack, which for the wood, for the hull, and then teak for the masts. This is wood available in the Western Ghats indigenously, so this would have been available to our ancient ancestors. Then there's coir rope. This is different from the ones you get in the market, in the sense it's much heavier and stronger, but it's generally the same idea. Coconut fiber, needles, Kundrus resin, it's a natural resin, fish oil, and brick pigment. And then came the business of construction. So the way you build a stitch ship is very different from the way you build a modern ship with steel or by nailing a ship together, because you basically stitch it up from the keel upwards. The whole strength of this thing, as you will see, is based on the stitching with the coir. It's not based on the frame. There's a very light frame, but the frame is not what holds it together. It's the stitching. And so here is how you go about it. First, you take planks of wood. You put it in the steaming chamber for many hours. It loosens the fibers. And then you pull it out, and within 1 or 2 minutes, you have to basically get it going and shape it into some shape. And I will show you how this is done. This is the steaming chamber. We are taking out the steam, as you can see. These are the planks getting pulled out after being steamed. And then when you get that, you then, after the steaming, this is the shaping process. As you can see, they have taken this steamed wood, and they have literally minutes before it again kind of dries up and takes shape. So they have to do this shaping as soon as they can. So it's being bent, as you can see, and then weights and other things are used. Now notice here that Babu is doing it entirely by eye. This is not great scientific measurement, so it really depends a lot on his skill. And then you take the planks, you drill holes along the 2 lines, and then you literally stitch it together like you stitch together clothes. As you can see, then Kundrus resin is put between the planks, and this is how you slowly build it up. Frame is inserted into it, but you can see very clearly the frame is not what holds it together. It is the stitching. And you can see how it slowly, the thing builds upward. And the hull got ultimately constructed in this fashion. So it was in 26th of February, finally the hull was done. It was Mahashivratri night. And we decided we'll put it in the water and see what happened. So the tide came in literally at midnight on Mahashivratri. We put it in the water, and lo and behold, the ship floated. So that was... So now we know the ship floats. So we began to outfit it. Here is all the outfitting, the gear, the masts, putting the deck in, and so on. We decided, interestingly, to use a stone anchor, which was even older design than the one we are using. So we are using a 1,500 to 2,000-year-old ship design. But the stone anchor that we decided to use is from 5,000-year-old stone anchor design. And the way it works is, as you can see, it's this triangle. The top hole is for the rope, and the bottom 2 holes are for the wooden stakes that go through. And so when you put it in the water, it sinks to the bottom, and those wooden stakes basically get stuck in the mud or the rocks, and that's how it works. We used it, and it works fantastically. In addition, we needed to put some Indian artwork. Here is something we put on the sails, the Ganda Birunda, which is a 2-headed eagle, which was a royal signia for many ancient Indian dynasties. It's also, even today, the state symbol of Karnataka, I believe. And the Surya, also common symbol. And the Simhayali, which is there. You'll see it in a lot of Chalukya and other temples as well. Then we dry docked it, cleaned it up, etc. And then it was time to take it out to sea. So the first time we took it out to sea, we towed it from Goa to Coir, which is the main naval base. And we didn't try to sail it because we didn't know how to sail it at that point, but just wanted to see the structural integrity. Then on the 21st of May 2025, that's a few days later, in the presence of the Honorable Minister for Culture, the ship was incorporated into the Indian Navy as INSV Kaundinya. It is today as much a part of the Navy as the nuclear submarines that are now being brought in. And the name Kaundinya has a significance because Kaundinya is the name of the oldest Indian mariner of whom we know by name. We know this because of Southeast Asian legend that there was an Indian merchant captain called Kaundinya who was sailing in a ship along the coast of the Mekong, which is now Cambodia, southern Vietnam, when he was attacked by pirates. And of course, they were battling each other with the pirates and the crew. But then he was surrounded, outnumbered, and so on. But then he got lucky because the leader of this tribe of pirates that he was attacked by was a beautiful warrior princess called Soma. And Soma saw Kaundinya and fell in love with him and proposed marriage. Now, We don't know exactly how willing Kaundinya was about the matter, but anyway, he clearly accepted the proposal. And the two of them set up the first Hindu dynasty of Southeast Asia called Funan. And from then on, many dynasties rose and fell in Southeast Asia, and they would all trace back their lineage to this marriage of Kaundinya and Soma. We don't know where exactly Kaundinya came from in India, probably somewhere on the east coast, but he's a very major character in Southeast Asian history. So now that the ship was named, incorporated, the issue became of trying to sail it. Now do remember that the sailing of the ship has to be completely learnt. Its sailing characteristics are totally different from modern sailing ships. So a crew was put together by the Indian Navy. It included 12 experienced sailors, many of them with national awards and so on. 4 officers, also experienced in sailing, 1 medic, and 1 random economist. And so there was a crew did their training from September to December after the monsoon. And they trained and trained. And I was there for several weekends as well. And slowly but steadily, we began to learn how this ship responds to the controls and so on and so forth. So then came the time for doing actually a voyage from Porbandar to Muscat was decided. We could have sailed it on either coast, but this was the one that we decided on, that we would sail it from Gujarat to Oman. This is a very ancient route that we decided. And so in the presence of His Excellency, the Omani ambassador to India, and all the many top officials of the Indian Navy, the flag off happened on 29th of December 2025. The plan was to do the maiden voyage from Porbandar to Muscat, in and around what is now quite well known, the Straits of Hormuz, and then to subsequently sail it back. And so on 29th, the ship was towed out of Porbandar harbour and left to its own devices on the high seas, and immediately we had a problem. The problem was that the wind was blowing directly from the west, and I told you that the square sails we have do not allow us to sail into the wind. The best you can do is to sail at a right angle to the wind. This is literally the best you can do. And so our captain Vikas Shioran, he had a choice. You can't stay still, by the way, in a ship like this, you can't stay still. You have to have some power in some direction. Otherwise, the tides or something will anyway drift you somewhere. So you have to go somewhere. And he said, okay, let's go north. So we began to sail north. It's a right angle to the wind from the west, we are going north. So we sailed 29th, then we sailed the 30th, then we sailed the 31st also. And so here we are in the evening of the 31st, heading straight to Pakistan. We are about 40 nautical miles. And not only are we sailing straight to Pakistan, we then noticed that there were a whole bunch of about a dozen odd fishing trawlers in the area that was also following us. And they were calling on Channel 16, which is the emergency open channel. They were calling Indian Coast Guard and informing them that there was this suspicious-looking ship that was sailing to Pakistan. And in fact, to use their language, ये पर्दा वाला पाकिस्तानी जहाज जा रहा है पूरा माल भर के, इसको रोको. Now, Vikas tried very hard to explain to them we are a 2,000-year-old design and all of this kind of thing. Let me say it just didn't buy any, it just didn't convince them. So you can see what the situation is. That's us looking over the side and there is this small flotilla following us. So here we are heading to Pakistan with 14 other ships and the wind is still blowing from the west. So thankfully the Indian Navy came on that line and explained what it was. So the other ships went off. But the wind was still from the west. So now we decided it was just too dangerous. By this point, we are less than 30 nautical miles from the border. And so we turned the ship down and we begin to sail southward. So this is New Year's Eve. We are sailing south back to Porbandar. And we are fairly depressed at this point. So we went to sleep on that evening, not terribly happy. Many of us slept on the deck. So I was sleeping on the deck as well. Hemant was on one side, Vikas on the other side, and we dozed off. And I woke up at a little about before dawn, and I happened to wake up, and then I looked up, and there was a flag. We had a flag at the back, and I suddenly noticed that it was blowing, suggesting the wind had shifted from the northeast. So I immediately woke up the whole crew. Everybody jumped up. We turned the ship, and finally we were sailing towards Muscat. We were sailing west. So this is the 1st of Jan, 2026. That's Vikas at the end, in the hat, in the black jacket. That's me in white, pretending to plot course, although I have no idea how that is done. And that's Hemant there, and of course some of the others as well. And this is what it felt like, because the wind had been blowing for the west, so it had already churned up the seas in a particular wave structure, which was heading towards us, and we were sailing literally into it. So although the wind wasn't very strong, the rolling caused by this was quite strong. So you get a feeling of how it rolls around, and that's one of the sailors at the back, Bariki, in the green t-shirt on the left. He is, as you can, manning the steering oar. And let me tell you, it's very tough, because sometimes a wave comes and whacks the steering oar in an awkward angle. And before we had completely become comfortable with managing this, there was one occasion where it come and hit him in the ribs and nearly threw him off the ship. So you get a feeling on how tough it can be. Now, do remember that this ship is completely, other than some communications and navigation equipment, it doesn't have anything modern on it. And it has to be manned all the time. Irrespective of weather, we had 4-hour cycles, and you can see the weather kept changing, but there's always, at a minimum, 4 to 5 people running the ship. And sometimes it rains, sometimes it's windy, and this is what it feels like. This is day 12. This is what you mean by fair winds and following seas. As you can see, the waves are behind us, pushing us along. There is a cloud system ahead of us, but it looks beautiful, and we are making 4 knots. So when you get fair winds and following seas, it doesn't roll you around as much as otherwise, as you can see. So we are onward to Muscat. And there were days when there were absolutely no wind. In fact, for a sailor, the really difficult point is not a storm, but days like this when there's absolutely no wind. And those who haven't been into the deep sea may have an impression that there are always waves there. That's not the case. There are days on which there's no wind and it's absolutely flat, glassy seas. Now, this is quite difficult, but it doesn't mean that the ship is not moving. There is still a current and you're still moving, but you have absolutely no control over the ship under these circumstances. So what is life like on this ship? This is day 9. We have just crossed halfway point, and you can see the sails are up. They are giving us good 12-13 knot winds. So we are making about 3 knots. As you can see, this is the crew. This morning, sails are up. There are some adjustments being made, and you can see all around us as things are. This is how it looks over the side. Chit chat on the boat. And this is what it looks like. We had a drone on board. You can see what it looks like seen from above. For 18 men, you can see there's not much space. This is probably, the usable space is about the size of this stage for 18 people. There's also, of course, some space in the hold below. There are no cabins, but there is a hold where all our equipment and food and supplies were kept. Also remember that we are sailing in winter. Most of the time is actually night, not day. 13 hours of night and 11 hours of daylight. And one of the things you learn is that your eyes can adjust so much to the darkness that when there is at least full moon night or even a half moon, you can actually do most things with just moonlight. But it does mean that when you do need do something intricate and you need more light, you can't actually use bright torch or anything because it just hurts your eye like hell. So in fact, the thing we began to use was a headlamp, but with red light. This is what it looks like if you attempt, say, for example, to hoist a sail at night. Other things about life on board, food. Since there's nothing modern on board, it also means there are no refrigerators. So after about 5 days, you run out of fresh rations. That's fruit, vegetables, and those kinds of things. So from there onwards, for the rest of the journey, another 12 days or so, we were on what is called dry rations. That is khichdi, for example, thepla, that's a Gujarati dish, dry, and you know why it was invented. And a little ahistorical, Maggi noodles. So that's us having khichdi on board. Yeah. And then there is a hold, as I said, below deck. So that's what it looks like. It's, as you can see, full of supplies. But it could get very hot in the middle of the day. So if you're off duty, then you can go down and chill out there. Or some people preferred sleeping there. Sometimes even I did. And of course, then you can sleep on the deck as well at night. But it can either be very, very windy or it can be romantic depending on your luck. So here is what it is on a windy day. Windy night. Sorry. Then practicalities. What does the toilet look like? So there were 2 of these baskets slung at the back for use as toilets. It's basically, you have to basically jump off the ship into it. And then after you have used it, you can use that bucket, you can see that, to clean yourself, draw water and clean yourself. And do remember, then you have to climb back in and you have to basically heave yourself back in because the side of the ship is above your head. So you have to literally heave yourself back in. And remember, all of this is happening while the ship is rolling, rocking, pitching, and it may be pitch dark because you have to go to the toilet even at night. So that is how it was. We did later on, I think, the 3rd or 4th day, decided that this was a bit dangerous. Do remember that this ship cannot turn back for you. If you fall in, your best bet is to swim towards Porbandar. So we thought that may be a bit risky. So we did create a harness that was mandatory to wear when you went in. But do remember that if you did fall in, and that harness would then, you would be swinging from the harness against the side of the ship, which meant that you would probably break several bones. But anyway, that might be still better than being shark food. We saw a lot of wildlife along the way. Here are some dolphins. Oh.
Crazy.
And then we also saw some bioluminescence. This is phytoplankton. If you disturb it, it gives you something akin to a fireworks display. Here is it. So it's quite an amazing thing. We saw some amazing sunsets. As you can see, this is and from the bow of the ship. You can see the yali. And then we also saw something we rarely see in urban life, a moonrise. It almost looks like a sunrise, doesn't it? And in this way, over the course of a little over 17 days, we made our way from Porbandar to Muscat. The straight journey is 1,176 kilometers, but As I told you, it depends on the wind, you go up and down and so on. So we covered much more. In fact, we have got about estimated 1,513 kilometers, but this is an underestimate because we plotted various points and then did straight lines between them. In reality, the ship was swinging up and down in multiple ways. So this is how the voyage happened. Along the way, as you can see, we went through the Pakistani EEZ, where we did have occasionally Pakistani drones keeping tab of us. Thankfully, the Indian Navy was also keeping tab of us throughout the whole process. We then went into Iranian waters, where we also saw the Iranian gunboats, which circled us from a distance a couple of times to see who on earth we were. None of them disturbed us, to be fair. And then we reached Oman, where we got a very, very kind and great welcome in the harbor in Muscat. And of course, also the Indian community was there to welcome us and so on. So this was the voyage from Porbandar to Muscat. This was the maiden voyage. And this is some of the members of the team, of Team Kaundinya. So this is what the ship looks like when it is in full flow. So that, ladies and gentlemen, was the voyage of INSV Kaundinya. Now let me ask Hemant to come up. And may I also ask Commodore Amit Srivastav. So over to you, Hemant, and you can also ask maybe the audience to ask some questions. You can answer some and he can answer some.
Well, sir, to start with, I still can't believe it that we have actually done this voyage. It may take some time to actually sink in. Around 6 to 7 knots is what we could make, because with the prevailing winds. This is comparable to...
No, so but be clear that this is under ideal conditions. Typically, you're doing 3.5 in good winds. Basically, if you get 12 knot wind, you're doing 3.5 knots.
Okay. So maximum reached was 6 to 7 knots and 3.5 knots average.
Yeah, you're not doing 6 or 7. No, 3.5 knot average, depends on the day. Okay. I'm giving you the rule of thumb.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think what you're asking is whether a modern ship, sailboat today, compared to these old ones.
This was the normal 3 knots of average speed as a thumb rule, and maybe sometimes strong winds it can go 6 to 7 knots. But modern sail, if what they use, I think they may be the competition and the sports, how much they reach in normal.
Yeah, so those which are designed for competitive sport, they are very light and different material. But regular sailing ships of this size or bigger also get about 6.5 to 7 knots. Is what I want to tell you. So this,
that's what
this ancient design has done what
I probably in modern design do. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, racing ships are totally different. I mean, they're not carrying all these, so many people, equipment and all this kind of thing. So,
hi, good evening. My name is Dhruv Rampuria, and first of all, congratulations to you and the team for doing probably what is unimaginable to a lot, but you made it happen. This may be slightly on a personal front for the three of you. And while the two of you were on the ship sailing through the international waters, were you actually questioning life choices that what you did, given the hardships you showed us, but still you sailed through it? If you look at it in hindsight, were you questioning life choices, that why I had to do it in the first place?
Hemant, were you questioning your life choices?
No, not at all. For me also, like, I'm a naval architect. I'm the back end designing the ships. Like Sanjeev sir, this was also the first time expedition experience for me. And you see, this ship rolls a lot. Seasickness is one thing that generally, even if you are an experienced sailor. But for me, I actually didn't have any such experience. So the moment you get sick on an expedition like this, everything that's every effort that you take amplifies as 10x or 100x. So thankfully, I didn't get till now at least. Other thing is, it was a team effort actually. You see, it's one thing to say it on land, but at sea, to have even the smallest of the evolutions, like the sir has showed, raising the sails, lowering the sails, it is a manual evolution. Everything is a coir rope. There a lot of friction with the wooden pulleys. To do it in the night, to take those decisions at sea with that kind of fatigue, it was a great experience for me.
For me, look, we had trained for this for several months, so we were mentally prepared. It's not like, you are there and you suddenly decide you don't want to be there or something like that. We had, the two of us had been working on the design for years. Then the ship got built. Then we had trained on it. So yeah, and do remember, you're not entirely sitting around thinking about these things. The ship is being actively run, and you're quite busy doing things on the ship. So no, I don't think we were questioning life choices. Certainly, it was quite an amazing experience, I would say. And I would give full marks also to the Indian Navy for the amazing crew they provided and all the other support they provided. Now wait, but there is one person who doesn't need to make this life choice, because he has been on the ship on our training, but I think I have to now try and encourage him to take part in a voyage. Why, would you like to say something about this? Can we get you to be on a voyage?
Definitely, most definitely. In fact, for me, sitting ashore, I was literally sailing with the crew. It was such an exciting thing to do and such a glorious thing to do, considering the vintage and the design and the relevance that the ship has for the country. But what question you were asking about the life choices or the danger or the thrill, while they will not admit it, sailing in a boat of this size in the open ocean, from a calm sea to a horrendous situation can arise in minutes or moments. While we had a naval ship around, even that ship will not be able to rescue them or assist them when the sea really gets bad. So therefore, the sea is always a testing place. It tests the limits of a human's endurance or capacity. So I think they've all braved it off very well. Should say that.
Quite amazed at the diverse interests you have had in life so far. Like, basically perhaps training as an economist or LD to financial world, and then taking keen interest in not just studying history, but even writing history books. And now this, it's truly amazing. And I was wondering that what really inspired you or got this idea into your mind that this was something which was doable, and that too by a person who perhaps didn't have much understanding or much exposure to this kind of a thing.
So as with anything, at some point this idea came to me during the COVID period. As some of you may be aware, I was part of the core team that managed the Indian economy during the COVID crisis. So I was expected to go to office every day. But I'm sitting in North Block, and there are 5 other people in that building, the Honorable Finance Minister, some of the secretaries, and myself, and nobody else. So while, of course, there was a lot of stress and we were doing all this other work, there's nobody to actually talk to. So sitting in my room in North Block, I began sort of maybe a way of escape, I don't know. But as the months were going by, sitting there alone, one of the thoughts that began going through your mind is that perhaps we can recreate one of these voyages. I don't know why it came to my mind. Maybe it was some idea of freedom, of getting out of that lockdown kind of situation. But that's how the idea came to me. And so then I began to research the matter and so on. And as I told you the story, I had basically come up with the idea of doing it, but I didn't have the capability of actually designing it. And so, as I said, serendipity is always favors the brave. So happened to be that I bumped into Hemant, and from there on, the whole matter took a much more serious turn.
Now that the project has succeeded, where do you see it going next? What do you want to do as the next step to take it further? And to the naval gentlemen here, can we expect a INSV Tarangini kind of a sailing mission around the world based on this technology in the future?
So the plan right now is to check whether it is in good condition, and I'll ask Amit and Hemant to tell us how good the condition is, because the ship is now back in Coir. But assuming that it's in decent shape, we'll take it to the east coast, and attempt to sail it on another ancient route, which is from Odisha to the island of Bali in Indonesia. It's called the Bali Yatra. So that is planned, but that is contingent to the state the ship is in. And after that, the idea is to put it in the naval, in the Maritime Museum in Lothal that's being built. So the ship will then be displayed there. But let me ask Commodore Srivastava how it looks right now.
I'll answer this as Amit Srivastav, not as Commodore Srivastav, because there is no official information on this. But I am looking forward to that this just being the start of the revival. So this project has just brought about a seed of thought that there is so much which can be done with respect to recreating and reliving the ancient maritime, lineage of the country. So I'm sure there will be much more projects. There will be bigger ships built, and they will do the longer voyage all around the globe. And it will happen, I'm sure.
Currently, we are back to Coir. We have dry docked it. For those of you who don't know, who are not aware, dry docking is a procedure where we lift the ship up. So we are now assessing the underwater hull, because while it was in water, there was no way to see it. So once we satisfy ourselves that the condition of the wood, the frames, and the wooden masts are there. There are 1.2 tons of each of the masts going 18 meters above. So there must have, and because of the inertial loads, the ship moves, a lot of stresses that would have come on. We need to assess those, and then we'll take a call slowly what to do next with that.
So I have a question about evasive maneuvers that you might have had to face. I think there was one close call when another ship was like cutting into your path. Evasive maneuver, because your ship cannot actually do this kind of a thing as you explained. So you were like...
No, so we thankfully didn't have to do any evasive maneuvers, because do remember that frankly, we have very limited capability of changing course. And one of the biggest dangers to ships like this in modern times is not so much the weather, but other ships, particularly oil tankers, who also cannot change direction easily. So the good news is that this issue is well understood. And so we were carrying a transponder on the ship so that all other ships in the area were aware of our location. Those of you know about flight trackers you may have seen. So the shipping world also has these kinds of transponders which tell everybody where the ships are. And we did not have any real serious situation of, some ships did come close, but nobody came so close as to be a real danger. There are obviously, as we came close to Hormuz, there were more ships there, no doubt. But we were lucky that basically all of them kept a good distance. I don't know about the return journey. Did you have an issue on return journey?
Not much, sir.
Nobody came in the way?
We had some container ships coming, but we had enough CPA.
Oh, maneuvering near the port is always, even in ancient times, is not done by sailing ships on their own. It is always done by a pilot ship. It is towed in. Even, by the way, the word pilot is today used for aviation. Its origins are maritime. And a pilot boat would, even in ancient times, would go out and hook the thing and tow it in the direction, because the last bit has to be rowed. It can, because of the nature of the wind, you cannot sail a boat into a harbor.
Correct. I know, because I'm a commercial pilot myself, so that's why I was asking about North China Sea. But I have been in contact with you since you started coming to Vivekananda International Foundation. About the history is what I am. You said stitch were preferred, not the nailed one. What is the reason for that?
So there is some controversy about it. Some writers say that because the Indians were they had certain ideas that, magnetic fields, etc., would influence the iron nails and so on. My own view is this is not true. This is not mentioned in any of our texts. This is there in some of these somewhat more fantastical Western texts that talk about this. My own sense of it is a very simple reason. You see, when you stitch the thing together, it allows the hull to be a little bit flexible. And if you happen to get stuck in a shoal or something like that, the ship doesn't break apart. Now, why is this an important thing? Because do remember that these voyages, particularly the summer voyages, were done because of monsoon winds. That's what is carrying you back and forth. So effectively, you are sailing during the rougher part of not during the average time, but the rough time, because that's what gives you the wind. Now, you know that during monsoons, how rough the coast can be. And you are going through waters like the Lakshadweep Islands, the Maldives. Then you're going, very often our ports are inside a river, things like in Kolkata port, Tamluk at that time, or Surat or whatever. So you are dealing a lot with coral reefs, shoals, sandbanks, and so on. Given that that was a significant risk, having a somewhat flexible hull was an advantage because it wouldn't fall apart. Now, the disadvantage of it, which I would have thought, was that you had all the stitching on the outside. So my initial thinking was that this was a major cost paid for the not aerodynamics, but the flow dynamics of the outside, because you have the stitching on the outside. And when we tested it also, there was some impact of this. But in the actual sailing, we found that it didn't have too much of an impact on the fluid dynamics of the ship. The ship behaved decently well, as I said. It's not incomparable to a smoother hull. In the end, the design changes happened because of other reasons, like cannons and so on. Indians continued to use the stitch design even after they were aware of the nail design. So there is some obvious advantage. But as I said, we have found some answers to it, but we are not 100% sure.
So regarding that only, something related to that, were these ships which carrying large tonnage or troops, say one ship carrying 1,000, were they also stitched?
Yeah, the large ships were also stitched together.
Has there been any study design done about, again, something similar to what you just asked, about larger ships using the same design? And can they actually, has there been any study?
So this is the thing, we need to do better work. Now that we've proved that this is a viable thing, we need to do some more maritime archaeology. The maritime archaeology in India is extremely poorly done. There must be hundreds of shipwrecks, at least, even though it's made of wood, some of them would have perhaps survived, because we have found them in other tropical waters. And given that there were literally thousands of ships going back and forth, I'm quite certain we'll find some. So this is an area of work that we need to do. Unfortunately, till very recently, we didn't have a marine archaeology unit even in ASI. A new one has been created, and maybe we will begin to take this whole matter more seriously from here on.